I'd like to present our next speaker, Kayla, Block-Torgerson. And today she'll be talking about navigating environmental on Highway 85 widening project from initial studies to EIS reevaluation and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Kayla.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here, sticking around to the last sessions of the day before we have our governor speaking, and then everybody's favorite part, the social hour. So hopefully everyone can stick around for that as well. So today, I'll try to stay here. There's a giant picture of my face, but you can kind of read some more of my background. But one thing I really wanted to kind of note about the Highway 85 corridor for myself is that it has been part of my career for almost my entire career, starting back in 2011, really with the Alexander Bypass project, and then continuing on further south now with the widening projects. So just kind of a unique thing that the work on that corridor has been going on for a long time. So just some overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be focusing on the project from the Long X Bridge crossing over the Little Missouri River to I-94. So just a little project background about that, and then kind of focusing on the temporal nature of this project. It started 10 years ago and how it has progressed through that time. So I'll kind of be highlighting some of the most unique aspects of that and kind of jumping from subject to subject. So again, if you have questions along the way, just hold them till the end, and I will get to them then. So just some, like I said, unique aspects of this project. So like I said, I'm going to be focusing on the project from I-94 up to the Long X Bridge crossing over the Little Missouri River. And this project was a continuation of all of the work that the DOT has been doing on the Highway 85 corridor, really from Williston south to I-94, with the replacement of the Lewis and Clark Bridge over the Missouri River, the four-laning from Williston to Watford City, and then the bypasses around Alexander and Watford City. But this project that I'm going to focus on, like I said, has been going on for starting 10 years ago with the environmental impact statement. So that was the initial NEPA document that was completed. And just a little background, if you're not super familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act, it just requires the analysis of potential impacts from major federal projects. So there's 3 levels of documentation, the lowest being a categorical exclusion. Then the next level of, environmental impact analysis is an environmental assessment. And then the highest level of assessment is an environmental impact statement. And these are really full disclosure documents that are done when you know that there's going to be some significant environmental impacts. And because this project was going to be looking at the four-laning of 62 miles of roadway through like a variety of different land uses, ranging from national parks, Forest Service land, and just the amount of right-of-way that would need to be acquired, it was pretty well known that there were going to be some impacts. So it started out as an environmental impact statement in 2015. And so, like I said, I'm going to be focusing kind of on the environmental aspects. So because this was an EIS, there were a lot of background data. So all of the baseline could be collected so they could determine what the impacts were. So there were some pretty unique environmental studies completed. There was your basic aquatic resource delineations, a lot of your cultural resource surveys, but there's also a lot of information gathered that's not typical for a DOT project, say your paleontological surveys, the bat acoustic surveys, and then the Dakota Skipper surveys, especially 10 years ago, those were pretty novel. So just some unique aspects of the project. And so that was kind of the kickoff to, That was kind of the kickoff to the project, and this all culminated in February of 2019, so almost 4 years later of data gathering and studying and all of the public input and just collaboration that happens in the NEPA process with a final environmental impact statement and record of decision. So that was issued in February of 2019. And part of that issuance was the 56 environmental commitments included. And so those commitments were in a lot of different categories and things that the project team worked to mitigate some of those impacts. And so you might think like 56 sounds like a lot, right? If you've ever worked on DOT projects, you might have one commitment for like temporary wetland impacts or something, but this was 56 commitments over 62 miles of roadway. And so as the DOT embarked on doing the design for these projects, and I'll say projects because the whole corridor has been split into numerous projects, the question kind of arises like, how do we deal with all of that? That's a lot to keep track of to ensure that you're in compliance with that NEPA document and just to make sure that like all of the stakeholder input that went into the planning gets applied. And some things to note are that all of those commitments kind of applied differently to each of the projects. From, just for some reference, from I-94 up to the intersection with North Dakota 200, that is split into 3 projects. And then from North Dakota 200 up to the Little Missouri River crossing at the Long X Bridge is split into another 3 projects. And then the bridge replacement was a project in itself. So you're looking at, 7+ projects, 56 commitments incorporated over those. It's just a lot to keep track of. And then again, the temporal nature of it. It was started in 2015 and we're in 2025 now, and we're just starting on the preliminary design for the southern portion of the project. So how are we doing this? Kind of the first step that we've developed is to create a dynamic tracking spreadsheet. And so this is just, a pretty basic tracking tool that we use where we've listed all of the commitments. And we have this for each project where we detail out the commitment itself and then we group them by category. So it's kind of a quick reference point to say, okay, what were our landowner commitments for this project? Okay, they're this. Okay, what specific commitments do we have when we're crossing Forest Service lands? So we can go easily reference what we have and see, okay, when does this need to be done? We have that kind of timing of implementation listed on this spreadsheet. Then we also track if the commitment applies to the project. Like I mentioned, there's some unique land that this project goes through, like the Theodore Roosevelt National Park North Unit. So some of the commitments included in the EIS only apply to that region. So this was our first step in tracking all of these things for the entire project. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so after we have this spreadsheet created and we determine everything that is required for each project, we've then created a memo document. And this is used more once we're nearing the end of that preliminary design to track the commitments that are applicable to each project and then also document how they have been applied. And so then this document is provided to the DOT so that they can, again, just track and ensure the compliance with the NEPA document. And then kind of the final step of this is to make sure that all of the commitments that require plan notes actually get incorporated into the document. So that anything that the contractor needs to be aware of and apply makes that final jump. Some things that we've, realized along the way and questions we have to ask are really what has changed since the EIS. We found that as the regulations have changed over time and what agencies are focused on now really changes how some of these commitments are required. For example, some of the field studies that are listed in the EIS and were written as commitments we've worked with the agencies and collaborated with them and looked at the data we have now, and it's been determined, well, we don't really need you to update these field surveys. For example, the Forest Service, back in 2015, biological evaluations on all of their land were completed. And as we've progressed through the project and worked with them, they've kind of determined we don't have a lot of available information, and we think the commitments of avoidance and documentation that you've already implemented, we don't need you to go out and resurvey because we don't think there's new information. So just kind of interesting that, 10 years ago they wanted these surveys done and they've decided we don't need to do them anymore. However, some of the field surveys need to be updated, just one of them being the aquatic resource reevaluations. So jurisdictional determinations from the Corps essentially expire after 5 years. So as we've gotten to design of the projects, all of these original wetland delineations need to be redone. Just for some numbers, when we started looking at this, we thought, how can we make this as efficient as possible for the DOT? Because there's a lot of wetlands. From the interstate to North Dakota 200 intersection, there was almost 250 aquatic resources delineated in the original 2015 delineations. And from 200 up to the Long X Bridge, there was about 120. And so it was a lot of acres of wetlands to redelineate and just number of wetlands. If you think, all of those resources need test holes, and we just looked for efficient ways to do this. So we worked with the DOT and the Corps to kind of develop a process for re-verifying these. And we came up with that we are going to obviously remap all the boundaries of the wetlands, because from an ecological standpoint, after 5-10 years, that can change quite a bit. But we're only going to resample the soil test holes for about every third resource. Soils don't change as much, it just didn't seem necessary. And then if there are any new resources, we would re-delineate those. So in this process, we're gathering a lot of data, right? You're looking at the 2015 information being updated with we reevaluated everything in 2022 and 2024. So you're looking at, if you've ever seen a wetland delineation report of this size, it's thousands and thousands of pages. So we still had to create kind of that paper report, and for context, to be able to upload it to the DOT's FTP site, we had to split it into 21 separate PDFs. So it was a lot of data, and so I will give some kudos to my coworker, Newt Bishop. He came up with a really good way to use and create a geodatabase, which is really what GIS is supposed to be used for, where you can kind of see it playing on the screen here, hopefully. Yep. So just a spatial reference, rather than having that paper document, that paper thing where you're looking at maybe page 7 has a description of the wetland delineation, and then you have to go to Appendix B for the 2015 data sheets, and then Appendix C for the updated 2024 data sheets, and then Appendix D for the photograph, and Appendix E for soils information. The geodatabase gives you that spatial reference. So you can zoom in, look at what the boundary looked like in 2015, what it looks like in 2024, pull up all of that associated data. And then we found it also really helps with visualizing how the wetlands are connected to each other, and that might help give us an idea of the jurisdictionality. So just helpful in planning and data management. So you can see it just showing how we have soils information and the topo information all just in that one spot. And another kind of unique aspect that doesn't affect a ton of the delineation field-wise, but just has affected when we're planning for mitigation and how the Corps is going to look at this project, was changes in WOTUS definitions. So back in 2015, when the project was originally delineated, we had the Rapanos decision and then that significant nexus decision for the connectivity and what counted as a water of the United States for jurisdictionality. But by the time we got to 2022, that significant nexus decision was gone. So again, it didn't super affect how we were doing things in the field, but when we got back into how determining some of those preliminary impacts and what would be jurisdictional change. And then again, when we went back out in 2024, some of the ideas around those other water drainages has again changed, and we feel like that's for the better. I have a lot of thoughts on other water drainages that if anyone wants to chat about that, we can, but those really finally have kind of been determined, okay, we don't need to worry so much about the ephemeral nature of where the water is going. Like I said, that kind of played into how things were planned for mitigation strategy. So when the DOT originally embarked on this 62 miles of roadway widening, they knew that there were going to be, quite a few wetland impacts. When those first jurisdictional determinations came back, I think about 80% of the delineated wetlands were jurisdictional. And so they knew they would be looking at individual permits for each project and would need quite a bit of mitigation. So the original plan was to complete a mitigation bank for the entire US 85 project. Again, combined with like the typical dift shift design to try to reduce impacts as much as possible. But as the DOT kind of, got into right-of-way negotiations, it's pretty difficult to establish wetland banks. Landowners a lot of times have a hard time saying, yeah, I want to put like a 99-year easement on my land so it can be used only for wetlands. And so they shifted strategy when they said, we can't do this. We'd like you to focus on on-site mitigation. So we started focusing on on-site mitigation, which again was pretty difficult because of the number of acres that needed to be mitigated and the desire to not acquire additional right-of-way along this roadway. There was already, there's a lot of right-of-way being acquired to widen the road. We don't want to have to get more right-of-way just to do wetland mitigation. So tried to develop that, and then the shift again has kind of determined, well, we're just going to use the existing DOT banks, which from our standpoint, permitting with the Corps, that makes it a lot easier. It kind of just pushes the issue down the road, but just shifting strategies throughout the process. So another part of the field studies that we've kind of taken a unique collaborative approach to are some updates to cultural resources. Now, in 2022, it was requested that all of the just Class 1 file searches were updated. And just there's so much activity along that area. There was the potential that, more inventories have been done, more resources were out there than they knew of in the 2015. So all the file searches were updated. But in between that original EIS and 2022, the North Dakota SHPO changed their regulations regarding isolated fines. So now they required additional shovel probes to be able to prove that those isolated fines were not associated with like a larger site. This again would have been like a lot of additional work to go out and do. So just trying to be as efficient as possible, because I think from North Dakota 200 north to the Long X Bridge, I think there was 70 isolated fines. So having to go out and do a number of shovel probes on each of those would have just been a substantial workload. The North Dakota DOT Cultural Resources Group, DOT Management, and SHPO worked together to determine that all of the requirements and all of the work that went into the EIS and all the avoidance that was already incorporated into the design was enough, so that if all of these isolated fines could continue to be avoided, we didn't really need to collect the data. If we were avoiding the site anyway, it probably wasn't as imperative to see if it went to a larger site. I don't know if anyone attended the wildlife crossing presentation that was just before this, but wildlife crossing has been a big part of the Highway 85 project. So during the original EIS, there were 2 technical documents that evaluated the need for wildlife crossings throughout the project corridor, and then that resulted in the construction of the underpass near the Long X Bridge, and that's been pretty successful. It's worked really well. But during the EIS process, the Game and Fish was continuing to conduct telemetry data and gathering all that carcass data, and they knew that further south on the corridor, kind of in the grassland area, specifically like around that grassy butte part of Highway 85, there were quite a few pronghorn crossings. And so they said, we don't have all the data right now, and we know you're not going to get to this design for a couple years, but we want to make sure that this is studied. So the DOT and Game and Fish entered into a memorandum of understanding agreement in 2017, saying, when you get to this area, you'll look at crossings. So in 2023, we got to that area in preliminary design. And so we created a memo looking at potential wildlife crossings through the grassland area of the projects. This memo just looked at both crossings and also wildlife fencing options. That was presented to DOT management, and then that will be used to help inform those decisions. As part of that memo, we also did a 2023 site visit, and this was a really good collaborative effort between consultants and the DOT district and central office, and Game and Fish were there to really look at the plans and how things were functioning on the existing areas where, you know, there's a wildlife crossing, there's wildlife fence, and how we can improve them based on like landowner requests, such as having wider cattle guards. All the equipment on farms is just getting bigger and bigger, so they requested that on the new portions, if there were wildlife accommodations, that things be changed. We also incorporated a lot of the Game and Fish comments that they've noticed. So in certain areas, having kind of paint colors blend into the landscape, using some of that like Bakken shale color of paint, revising wildlife fence heights. In some areas, the fence needs to be 10 feet high. Some areas, it can just be 8 feet high. And then also looking at jump out locations and confirming where those are needed, and also like adding more jump out locations and gates, which our surveyors very much appreciated, because it's really hard to like scale a 10-foot fence, and so to drive 20 miles to get around it. Having more crossing locations was welcomed by both wildlife, I think, and people needing to cross the fence. Another kind of unique aspect along this corridor is the Section 4F issues. So Section 4F was part of the 1966 Original Transportation Act that required kind of an additional look at publicly owned parks, wildlife management areas, historic buildings, and it requires that any use to those properties be analyzed. So there's a whole separate process, and the different types of use when they're looking at these properties, there can be permanent use, there can be like temporary use, and then there can be constructive use, which is kind of a unique use aspect where you're not maybe touching physically that Section 4F property, but the proximity of your project affects it enough that it impacts negatively how that property is used. So say if you're doing a project a mile away, but this is a really serene place that's known for quiet, your construction still is an adverse impact. So along this corridor portion of the project, there was a Section 4F property identified in the EIS, and that is the Bighorn Sheep Management Area on Fish and Forest Service lands. Kind of see highlighted there, just south of the Long X Bridge. And in the EIS, it prioritized no use of these Section 4F properties, but during preliminary design, it was kind of determined that a minor amount of right-of-way needed to be acquired through this management area, basically for snow storage. through that Badlands section, there's not a lot of area, but there's a lot of snow. And so working with the official with jurisdiction, which is the term for whoever's managing that 4F property, so in this instance, the Forest Service, we came to the conclusion that even though there would be a use, it could be what's called a de minimis use. So that means there's no adverse impact. But even though there's no adverse impact under Section 4F, you still have to go through the process. And so that involved obtaining official letters from the Forest Service, working with Fed Highway to issue a determination, and then also creating public notice and a chance for the public to comment. And so with the DOT, we created a just website on the DOT's site that could give all the information people might need, like where is this 4F property? What is 4F? And then how do we comment? And that process, I think, it didn't result in any comments because it was a pretty minor amount of right-of-way being acquired. And then another kind of unique aspect to this project is the EIS reevaluation. Now, when you do an EIS, especially because over time there are a lot of things that can change from regulation, other projects that happen in the area, the need to look at more impacts happens quite often. So sometimes you'll do what's called a tiered NEPA document where you'll do an EA that's then tiered onto that EIS. But because the DOT knew from the start that this project would happen over quite a long time, they created an EIS reevaluation process. And this is something that they worked with Fed Highway and everything was agreed to. So basically, if there are major project decisions or just temporally every 3 years, this EIS reevaluation is done. So it just gives a chance to kind of update all the data analysis that was included in the EIS and adapt as necessary. So it's kind of a checklist format with additional information that's added. And this is really a kind of unique thing that helps to just move the project along because lots of changes can happen, and rather than having to reopen the entire document, this can disclose those impacts just like EIS did. And with that, that's kind of the highlights of what has been going on with the project. Like I said, we are currently doing preliminary design from I-94 to North Dakota 200. And then from 200 north, the final design has happened. So still ongoing. There'll still need to be additional studies, field studies done. So if anyone has the first question, I would take it.
On the geospatial data, did it show any, but what did that show, 2-lane versus 4-lane in the same traffic on?
If what? Sorry.
Geospatial data, the noise, you said you had a study on the geospatial data.
Yep.
What did that show?
Yep, so during the initial EIS, there was the noise analysis done. So the process for noise analysis is determining if there are noise impacts. They have to reach certain thresholds, and there weren't noise impacts from that study. If there had been, the process is to look at the reasonableness and feasibleness of creating noise attenuation. So it's not very often in North Dakota that actually like happens, where it rarely happens where any project reaches the level of having an actual noise acoustic impact and then getting to that reasonable and feasibleness of creating any mitigation is pretty rare. I think our only noise walls are in Fargo. So, but this analysis showed that there were not noise impacts that need to be mitigated. Okay, well, thank you guys for coming and enjoy the rest of your evening.